Have you ever felt like your life was on a treadmill? They brought the treadmill up here. Can anybody see that treadmill there? Now, sometimes life, that's a symbol of our lives. We just run, we get on that treadmill, we run, but we really never get anywhere. Sometimes, have you ever felt like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day? You just kind of keep waking up to the same old, and life just keeps running along, but nothing really changes. We live in a very fast-paced culture. Run is what our culture is all about today. We run so fast. In fact, when people move from New Jersey and Washington and Baltimore and they come and they retire here down on the lower shore, I've noticed that they'll often talk to me about how they came to Sussex County and to our area and our region because they want to slow down, and they believe that lower, slower Delaware will provide them an environment where they can kind of relax and slow down. And I don't have the heart to tell them that lower, slower Delaware is running faster than it ever has. I grew up here. Anybody ever remember what it used to be like in Sussex County? I get upset when I have to wait at the light twice, in Milton, because there's so much traffic. Lower, slower Delaware. I remember areas growing up where you could lay in the middle of the road because no cars would come down that road. And now, it's like a madhouse. It is. But now for us, compared to other places, it's slower. It is. Trust me, it is. I've been in other places. You go to Indonesia, you want to find out how fast it is. They're all on these little motorcycles. It's crazy. We're going faster and faster all the time, and we're going to have to learn to manage this pace. I preached at a retirement facility last week, and after the message, I got talking to a couple of the residents, and one delightful elderly lady, we somehow got our conversation, how the conversations morphed into a discussion on technology, and she said to me how technology is ruining our lives because we're having to go so fast, and I agreed with her. I said, technology really is causing us to move fast, but I didn't have the heart to tell her the rest of the story, and the rest of the story is this: it's not going away. Technology is going to continue to advance. It's going to continue to speed up our lives. And so we're going to have to not let it ruin our lives, because it's not really technology that's ruined our lives. It's only when we allow technology or anything else in the culture to begin to drive our behavior. And so, years ago when they were looking at technology in the early 50s, around 1950, 1960s, sociologists were looking at, the coming technology and the advancements, like washers and dryers and ovens and refrigerators. And then, they weren't even dreaming of cell phones and the internet at that point. But when they were looking at just the modern conveniences that technology has provided, they began to get worried because they thought America would come into a place of a time of leisure where the average person would work 2 to 3 hours a week because of modern technology. Now, they missed it, didn't they? You see, technology is a wonderful thing. It's not bad. I love the fact that my wife and I don't have to go down to the river to wash our clothes. I love the fact that I can come into the house, go into the freezer, find a hot dog that's been frozen or something that she cooked a week ago, and I can pop it in the microwave in 2 to 3 minutes. I can have a meal. That's a wonderful thing. Technology has provided so much. It's so positive. But there's been a downside, and that downside is instead of producing a culture that is going slower, it has produced a culture that's running faster. I remember in the 1990s when my wife was a speech pathologist in the school system in Maryland. And she came home one day really excited because they bought all the speech pathologists and the special ed teachers, they bought them laptops. Really nice laptops. And we thought, this is going to make your life so much easier. It's wonderful. Until the demands for paperwork went up. And with the technology came another demand. And so my wife began to spend a lot of time doing paperwork, and it really didn't provide, the heavenly experience that people really were looking for. You've heard it said that life is a marathon. And I used to believe that, but I don't believe that anymore. A marathon, if you go to run a marathon, you have to pace yourself. You got 26.2 miles to run, so you begin to pace yourself so you can finish this 26 miles. But life isn't lived like that. Life is not lived at a constant speed. In fact, life is a marathon of sprints. We sprint and we rest. We sprint and we rest. We sprint and we rest. We have all these things to do, then we rest. The problem is that I see in society today isn't technology, isn't the pace of life, it's that we're not resting. That we're running these paces, but we go from one thing to the next instead of learning to stop somewhere or carving out time. And I know at different seasons it's more difficult than others. So we have to learn how to carve out times of rest or we're not going to make it. Randy Frazee talks about this in his book, Making Room for Life. It's a shame that we have to write a book called Making Room for Life, but this is what's happening. He says, simply put, many of us have squeezed living out of life. We don't have time to soak in life and deep friendships. We're always running around trying to get to the next event. He says this presents at least two major problems. First, our busy lifestyles stimulate a toxic disease called crowded loneliness. Crowded loneliness is the feeling that you're in a crowd, like a group today. You can be in a group like this with all these people here and yet still feel lonely. He said, but there's even a deeper problem. He says, in our original design, we were created with a connection requirement, and if this requirement is not met, we die. And I've met a number of people. I've had them in my office. I've talked about this many times. That's why I return to this subject periodically to help us. Because, folks, when we run at the speed we're running, eventually something within us breaks. We get numb. We don't soak in what's around us. We don't have deep relationships. We don't have a deep relationship with God. Church becomes mundane. It's amazing how bad the preaching gets when you're in a hurry. You just slow down and soak some of it in, it might actually get better. In fact, I tease people all the time when they say the preaching's not been too good. I say, why don't you pray a little harder? It's amazing what happens when we just get in a hurry, and this is what life is doing for us. It just keeps pushing us. I had lunch with Bill Sammons from The Bridge, the radio station The Bridge, a couple weeks ago, and we were just catching up, and he showed me the radio station, and we went out to lunch and just kind of caught up with one another, and we got talking about a new video that's out on the internet called Godspeed. And this Godspeed video series is actually a series of messages, and it talks about how in the first century, people lived at 3 miles per hour. You know why they lived at 3 miles per hour? Because that's the walking speed. You know, they didn't get on cars and buses. They may have had a camel or a donkey, but they still walked. And life was lived at 3 miles per hour. But our lives are no longer lived at 3 miles per hour. Our lives are lived at lightning speed or at the speed of light, because now you can get on the internet and you can be around the world through Skype in a matter of seconds. You can get on a plane and we can be around the world in 24 hours. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, the experiences and opportunities that we have today, no generations before us had the opportunities that and they're wonderful things. These are good things. These are not bad things. But if we don't learn how to manage these things, they're going to kill us. You know, back in the 80s or 90s, I remember the Virginia Slims commercials. They had the cigarette commercial where they would have some beautiful woman on a billboard say, "You can have it all, baby." And we try to live like we can have it all, and having it all is killing us. It's putting us on a treadmill of running from one thing to another, but we never seem to get there. Technology has created an opportunity for us to live at a pace we know we can't keep up with. You know, back in Jesus' day, they walked everywhere. They didn't need a treadmill for exercise. They got that going back and forth to places. Kind of reminds me of the young kid that he was 15 turning 16, and you know, he was pretty rebellious, but he decided that he wanted his dad to buy him a car. So he went to his father and he said, "Dad, I tell you what I'll do. I'm going to get my grades up. I'm going to get straight A's next quarter." He said, "If I get straight A's next quarter, and I'm going to clean my room. My room is going to be immaculate." And he says, "Dad, if I do those two things, will you buy me a car?" And the dad says, "Yep, but one more thing, son, you got to cut your hair." Because he had real long hair, kind of like Pastor Bob did in 5th grade. It was down the middle of my back. I mean, I was a hippie. And so 6 months go by and the kid gets his grades up. He's got straight A's. He's cleaned his room. I mean, you could eat off the floor. It's absolutely beautiful. And he goes to his father and he says, Dad, look, I've got my grades up. They're straight A's and I've got my room clean. And he says, will you buy me a car? And he says, son, I said, did you have to cut your hair? If you cut your hair, I'll buy you a car. He says, Dad. He said, even Jesus had long hair in the Bible. He said, Dad said, son, that's true. But Jesus also walked everywhere he went. Life used to be lived at the speed of walking. Now it's in a hurry, and now we have to figure out how to manage it. I said last night in the Saturday night service that we're trying to build first century community while we're living in the 21st century, and I've not read a book yet that tells me how to do that. I'm trying to figure this thing out. How do we have deep relationships when we're running so far and the demands of life are so heavy? How? I'm asking those questions. Because we're trying to help you get what God has for you. We're going to have to learn to manage because there's technology coming, folks. I'm going to do a series at some point called On-Demand Living. Just the fact the way TV has changed. You can watch anything you want when you want for as long as you want. Now people binge watch. They literally don't watch a show until they turn it on Xfinity, spend the whole weekend. I did it just not too long ago. My wife and I saw this cute little series and I started watching. Next thing I know, I'd watched 8 shows. About the 9th or 10th, my wife said, could you get off, maybe you're lazy behind and do some laundry around here? No, she didn't say that. She said it nicely. She just went. Now, the good news is that the Bible isn't silent on this. Luke chapter 2, verse 7, we read this in the Christmas story every year, but we kind of go over it. It says, and she, Mary, brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no room in the inn. When Jesus came into the earth, there was no room for him. And I submit to you, if there wasn't room for Jesus back in the first century, there certainly isn't room for Jesus in our lives today. That we have to make room for Jesus. We have to make room for what's important. We have to make room for one another. You see, Luke went on to write in his gospel another story that when I connect these two stories, I see there's an undercurrent theme that Luke is trying, I think, to warn us of even in our relationship with Jesus Christ. You see, in Luke chapter 10, Luke writes these words, found in verses 38 through 42. This is the same one who wrote, there's no room in the inn. It says, now it happened as they, this is Jesus and his disciples, went, that he entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she approached him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore tell her to help me. But Jesus answered and said to her, Martha, Martha. And whenever Jesus uses your name twice, it's not good. It's not good. Simon, Simon, Jesus said to Peter before he told him he was going to deny him 3 times. When Paul was called Paul, Saul, Saul. Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things. But one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part which will not be taken away from her. Now, Martha was on a treadmill for Jesus. And this has always concerned me. In fact, when I was a young Christian, just had gotten saved and began to attend church, and I began to look at the church culture, and I knew from that moment that I received Christ that I was called to be a pastor. I knew that right away. And I was just kind of growing, and you're doing everything in the church, and I began to look around, and I began to notice something. I began to notice that when people would receive Jesus Christ, they'd bring him into the church, and next thing that I would see is they were extremely busy in the church doing all this stuff. And what I began to think about this was all we did when we brought people to Jesus is we took them off a secular treadmill, a worldly treadmill, a busy treadmill over here, and we put them on the treadmill for Jesus. And I vowed to God, this is around 19, 20 years of age, I said, Lord, when I become a pastor, I'm going to do everything I can not to create a church like that, to not just take people off one treadmill and put them on another, and I think that's the challenge. And I've talked to pastors about this, especially when I was young, and I looked like I was about 12. One local pastor used to call me the mustache. because I've only shaved my mustache off one time since I was 14 years of age, and that's when I was in my 30s or early 40s, most probably 40s. And I couldn't grow a mustache till I was like 38. But every time he'd see me, he'd tease me because I had peach fuzz. So he called me mustache. But he and a number of other pastors would say to me, he would say, Bob, because I wasn't a pastor then, he said, Bob, that's a good idea, but let me tell you what's going to happen. He says, if you don't keep your people busy, somebody else will. And that broke my heart. I said, is this what Christianity's come down to, that I have to keep you as a pastor busy just so that you don't navigate into other things? And I've observed that often he's right. We're addicted to busy. It's in our culture. It's in the air. We have a hard time slowing down. But when we receive Jesus, we just sometimes replace the treadmill of the world for the treadmill of the church. I'm going somewhere with this church. In fact, this is central to what God's trying to do here at Eagle's Nest. See, Martha got on the treadmill for Jesus. She's more worried about serving Jesus than she is soaking in his presence. Ladies, when's the last time you took a bubble bath and just soaked in the tub? I don't take bubble baths. I don't know how many men do. We take brick baths. What do you think, bubble baths? We put bricks in the water. When's the last time, guys, you just soaked in something? Like, one thing I appreciate about hunters is they'll go out in the morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, get out of a warm bed in a nice warm house and go out into a cold, freezing outside, rainy, and they'll sit there and hunt. And you know one of the secrets is, I think about that, is they have time alone. Them and a buck. Oh. And then they get violent. You know, I would start hunting. She's more worried about serving Jesus than she is being in his presence. And that's what can happen to us. You see, our mission statement is serving our community. And see, folks, I don't write these things down and just like move on. This is like the center of my world. What I'm trying to help you do, this is the mission of our church, is to serve our community by doing good and building relationships and making fully devoted followers of Jesus. The problem is, if we don't learn how to pace our lives, we'll never build relationships. Because we'll stay so busy serving. And right now, Jesus is in Mary's and Martha's presence. And instead of enjoying and soaking his presence in, Martha is cumbered about with serving. And nowhere in the Bible will you find serving's a bad thing. Serving's a good thing. And nowhere in the Bible will it say that we ought to just sit around on our duffs all the time and not do anything. But there's a time we have to learn to soak. Why do I stop in the middle of the service like I do? Some people new to the church, it's like some people said, that's not very seeker sensitive because people don't know what you're doing. And Pastor Bob, some people think you're just nuts. I say it's okay. You can think I'm nuts. But I'm doing two things. One thing I'm doing is literally slowing down because I'm a type A. I'm preaching to myself. I'm type A. I'm triple A. I used to deny, I used to say, I'm an A minus. I'm a triple A. So I've learned to stop in my life and say, Lord, I can get ahead of you. And so even in the service, we have an agenda. I prepare my sermons, but I'm like, Lord, I'm going to make it a practice. When I get up here, I'm going to stop and I'm going to wait on you. And I'm going to teach, this is the second thing, I want to teach your people how to slow down and soak. Lord, what do you want to say? What needs to be done? Your presence is here. The Bible tells me that when his people gather together, his presence is here. So will we stop for a moment and soak? It's very hard because when we get in this pace of life, it's, sharing last night that, one of the things that happens to us when we get busy. Have you ever been so busy, like you're out night after night after night, and you're doing this, you're doing that, and then finally you have a night off, and you sit down on the couch with friends or by yourself or with your spouse, and you sit down, and as you sit down, you feel guilty because you're not doing something. Has anybody ever experienced that? That's because we've been on the treadmill and we begin to believe by our emotions that if we're not doing something, we're not serving, we're not putting something out, we're not producing something, that we're not doing something for God. And sometimes God just wants us to sit down and say, Lord, where are you? Or you're here and I just want to enjoy your presence. Folks, when I get in the middle of service, just when I'm the most attuned to what God's doing, that's why I stop. I could sense some things this morning. I could have gone on with what I was sensing, but I felt like we just took the time we needed. It's like a shepherd looking out over a sheep. That's what happens to me when I'm up here. I can begin to see and feel and hear more, feel and know things. I just know things. People tell me, how did you know that? I said, I don't know. All of a sudden, I just knew it was there. Because I slowed down. Lord, what are you saying? The danger to being Martha is that we become lopsided in our Christianity. We teach three practices that if you'll make these regular practices, you will break through in your spiritual life. Number one is worship. If you'll drive a stake in the ground and say, weekly, I'm going to leave my house, and I think that's big, because there's a movement now so you don't have to leave your house. I think that's baloney. We got to disrupt our schedules. The whole idea of Sabbath, the whole idea of worship and gathering together is the ecclesia, is the come together. That's what the word church means in the Bible. You cannot be the church outside these walls. The church is when we gather together. You're the kingdom of God when you leave here. But we're the church, the ecclesia, the gathering of God's people together. And when you drive that stake in the ground and say, I'm going to worship come hell or high water, and it was high water today. I'm going to leave. I'm going to disrupt my comfort zone. I'm not going to do what's convenient. I just shared this week with somebody. I said, we're not trying to build convenience by having multiple services. We're trying to accommodate the pace of life. And there's a huge difference in those statements. Convenience leads to complacency. Convenience leads to not costing anything in worship, as we read earlier. Convenience will get us in trouble, but accommodating, we do need to accommodate. We need more services. We need to do things more often. I see a day here where things are going on in this church building 7 days a week. Why? Because 7 days a week people work. People have to be accommodated so their schedule so they can worship. But we still have to take the time, because we could prepare. You know how many things? We had 68, 69 things going on in this building, and I still I don't have anything I can connect to. I want to smack people. When do you want it? Well, 3 o'clock in the morning on Tuesdays, and then I have a doctor appointment, so can we make it the next day at 4 o'clock? And I'm like, I want to shake people. And it's this treadmill. We're running so fast. We don't even know when we come into anything. We're demanding. We want this, we want that. And it's not because we're bad people. We're just trying to survive. And so we're going to have more services. But we're trying to create a culture here that says, I can't be at everything in the church. If the church building is open 7 days a week, I don't want you here. I don't want to be here. We're creating a culture very intentionally. Because Martha was on a treadmill of service because Martha was making the same mistake that we make. When Martha does here is she's all encumbered by her service. And then it says in verse 40, it says, Martha was distracted and she approached Jesus and said to him, Lord, do you not care? What Martha does is she'll criticize Mary and she'll criticize Jesus because they're not helping. And folks, when we get encumbered and we get lopsided, see, there's three practices. I forgot my point. It's three practices: worship, connect, serve. I've noticed over my years of ministry that some people love worship. Some people love worship. I don't know what just happened. Some people love worship. Some people love to connect, and some people love to serve. And what I found is we'll gravitate towards the one we love and leave the others, and we get lopsided. And I believe we'll be stronger in one over the other, but if you're a server, you need to learn to worship and connect. If you're a connector, you need to learn to worship and serve. So Martha got lopsided and focused solely on service, and what happened is she began to get critical of those that were not like her, particularly Jesus and Mary. And I don't know about you, but I don't think it's probably a good idea to get critical of Jesus. It doesn't work well. But Martha's mistake was she thought that her problem was that she was busy. And when we feel like our problem is busy, the solution we come up with is we've got to get somebody on the treadmill with us. If I'm running on the treadmill and the answer is I'm too busy, how do I get somebody on the treadmill to kind of help me move this thing? And this is the wrong solution. And the reason she came up with the wrong solution is that she came up with the wrong problem. And often people do that. We often do that. We miss the problem. That's why Einstein said if you have an hour to solve a problem, spend 55 minutes on figuring out what the problem is and 5 minutes on the solution. Because the solution becomes obvious when you figure out the real problem. Now, Martha, like us, thought she was busy. In fact, when I was doing my doctoral research for my thesis, which I just finished this week, I finished it and they sent it back with corrections, and I think I'm done. Praise God. I'm off the treadmill. But one of the things that I learned was that sociologists have studied what's going on in our culture. Robert Putnam says when Americans are asked about why they're dropping out, do you know that people in America are dropping out of all civic engagement, not just church? I hear all the time how church attendance is going down, and it is. Throughout the country, church attendance is down. Throughout the nation. But that's only part of the story. We have less firefighters. We have less civic engaged volunteers. We have less people involved in politics. There's something happening in our culture that is broader and deeper than just what's happening in the church. In fact, the church has fared fairly well compared to these other things. And when people were asked in America why they're dropping out of civic engagement, what they found was that they're just too busy. This is what they said. Robert Putnam writes, he says, "I don't have enough time is the reason that Americans will offer for not cite most often for failure to participate. Too busy is by far the most common explanation we offer for not volunteering. We certainly feel busier now than we did a generation ago." He said, "The proportion of those who say we always feel rushed jumped by more than half between the mid-'60s and the mid-1990s. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, more of us reported that we work hard most of the time and that we frequently stayed late at work. That the groups that feel most harried or hurried are full-time workers, especially those with advanced degrees. So the more education you get, the more is expected of you. Women, because women are now working out of the home. People aged 25 to 54, and I'm so thankful I'm 54. That means next year I'm not in a hurry anymore. And parents of younger children, especially single parents." Now, that's what people said, but yet when he did the research, he found that being busy isn't the problem. He said people who report the heaviest time pressures are more likely, not less likely, to participate in community projects, to attend church and club meetings, to follow politics, to spend time visiting friends, to entertain at home, and the like. He said even among the 1/3 of Americans who report that they have spare time, which I'd like to meet those people, church attendance has dropped by 15 to 20%. In other words, the people that have the most time on their hands are attending church less. Club going has dropped 30%, 10% more than church, and entertaining friends by 35%. That means we're not having people over for dinner. And that's just over the decades between 1980 and 2000, and I don't have research for what's happened since then. See, Martha's response to the situation is, "I'm too busy," and because of that, she engages in what's called the amplification phenomenon. Psychologist, psychiatrist, writer, author John Ortberg writes, "Suppose you're emptying the dishwasher. Your spouse or roommate is sitting on the sofa, reading the newspaper, watching TV, doing nothing, being lazy. At first you don't mind. You're sure that when they see how busy you are, they'll join you. But they don't, so you start to get angry. And as you get angry, you bang the plates on the counter. With a little bit more authority, make a little bit more noise. You're trying to get their attention. You slam the cupboard doors shut so the sound is clearly audible over the TV. You want the other person to recognize that their slothfulness is selfishness. You want them to feel their guilt. Fall at your feet and learn from your work ethic. If that other person, Ortberg says, has a high threshold of guilt tolerance, you have a very loud house." See, Martha is rattling the dishes. She's slamming the cupboard door because she's on the treadmill. She's busy, and now she wants Mary to help, and she's critical of Jesus. Don't you care? But see, Martha's busyness was being driven by the culture. You see, the Bible says in verse 38 that it was her house. In that culture, if you had somebody over to your house, there were cultural obligations you had to fulfill. There was things you had to do in order to be a good host. And Martha wants to be a good host. Now, it's no doubt that Martha loved Jesus. In fact, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, her brother, they were some of Jesus' best friends. There's no doubt that she wanted to be with Jesus because she opened her home to him. There's no doubt that she wanted Jesus to be honored by her service. but the expectations of her culture kept her on the treadmill. You see, in that culture, it was understood that you would be greeted with a kiss, that your feet would be washed, that your head would be anointed with oil, that food would be prepared, and you would wait on your guest. And that's what Martha, by the way, her name comes from the word Mar, which means mistress of the house. Her last name was Stewart. She had these cultural obligations, and it was even worse than that. Not only did Martha have all these obligations, her lazy sister Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet while he preaches. And what's amazing about that is if you study history and you understand that before Jesus, you know how many rabbis, sit at the feet of somebody was a technical term for being taught by a rabbi, by following a rabbi. She's not just sitting at his feet, she's acting like a disciple. She's being taught. And in that culture, women weren't taught by rabbi. And you know how many rabbi had female disciples before Jesus? None. Not only is Martha being consumed by the culture, Mary's violating culture, and she's acting out of ordinary. She's offending. She's offending Martha, because Martha's going to get a bad reputation. And not only that, Jesus has come to a home of 2 single women. The scandal of it all. Rabbi didn't do that. Rabbi had a very poor view of women in this time. But culture was keeping Martha distracted. Now, I'm not trying to be critical of the culture, nor am I trying to be critical of us. The culture is what it is. We can get on a plane and be in California in 6 hours. I don't know why anybody want to go to California, but you can. It's wonderful. In 3 hours, you can be in Chicago. It's wonderful, the technology that we have, but we have to manage it, or it's going to manage us. It's going to keep us on the treadmill. Now, Jesus tells Mary or Martha the secret to getting off the treadmill, and it's no different then than it is now. It's simple, it's just not easy. In verse 41, he says this. He says, Jesus answered, Martha, Martha, you're worried. That word worried means anxious. It means to have too many things on your mind. It's to have your mind overwhelmed by things. Have you ever, I know when because I struggle with anxiety at times. And I know when I'm getting too busy, because what will happen is, you ask my wife, I'll fall asleep before my head hits the pillow. Literally, I'm driving into bed and I'm asleep before I hit the ground. I ask my wife, before I hit the pillow, man, I'm asleep. But I'll wake up at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning and I can't get back to sleep. There'll be 100 things on my mind and I just can't turn it off. Have you ever experienced that? That's anxiety. And anxiety runs like that. And that's how I know, and I can always tie it together. I've been out 7 to 10 nights. I've not had a day off. I've violated Sabbath. I've not had time to soak. I've not taken a bubble bath. That's what that word worry means. Troubled, bothered, upset, stressed out by many things. You know, this got so bad for me, I decided to go see Dr. Fred Antonelli about 6 months ago. I said, I'm really struggling. And I began to get angry like Mary or like Martha. I did. I began to get angry, and I said, Lord, this is not like me. I don't usually get angry in this way. I get irritated real quick. That's my temperament, but I don't get angry. And Dr. Fred said, I can't help you. So he sent me to, now he was being funny, but he sent me to a Dr. Bob Roush, and Dr. Bob Roush did a personality test on me. And here's what he said. He said, you're hyper responsible. I said, what's that? He said, you want to take on the weight of the world. You've got to learn to take your responsibilities and let everything else go. That's what Martha's doing here, and that's what some of the responsible people around here do. We take on the weight of the world, and that's what we're teaching with our 3 values: respect, responsibility, relevance. Responsible. I teach this stuff, and I'm still violating it. Because the culture forces us, it presses us on the treadmill, and we feel these obligations. And that's what Martha's feeling, and that's what you're feeling. If I stop this, the world's going to end. If I don't take care of this, the world's going to end. But some of us are hyper responsible. We're doing things that we ought not be doing. Man, I've had this happen several times, and every time it comes back to the same thing. that I take on things I ought not. Jesus said, Martha, you're troubled and worried about many things, but one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part which will not be taken away from her. And this is interesting because those words, good part, Jesus got a little word play going there. In the Greek, it means like the part of the meal. It can mean a better part of the meal. So it's like Jesus saying to her, look, Martha, Mary, you want Mary to get on your treadmill. You want me to use my authority to get Mary in the same predicament, because misery likes company, as you're in. But Mary has chosen the steak, and you're trying to eat the potatoes. That's what that's what it means in the culture. He's saying Mary has made a better decision. You see what Jesus is saying? He says one thing is needed. And in our lives, what we have to begin to figure out is what are those one things in our lives that are needed. And that means at the time. We have to learn to prioritize. I've had people come in. I don't know how I violate this so often. I said last night, look, I'm not even preaching to you. I'm preaching to me because I'm a hypocrite in this area. This is an area I don't live up to. I find myself fixing it, and I find myself back where Martha is. And I want you to learn by my mistakes as well as my successes. In fact, you'll learn more because I don't have as many successes as I have mistakes. But we can get back on that treadmill, and we have to learn to manage it. You're going to have to run on the treadmill. And I said last night as well, to some people, you need to get off your lazy behind and do some work, because God said work 6 days and take a day off. Some people aren't working enough, but there's others of us, the people that are doing things around here, around Eagles Nest, particularly in our church, we have people that work their fingers to the bone, and we need a few people to help, but we're not trying to get you busy for busy's sake, and we're trying to balance all this. We have activity here not to keep you busy. We have activity here to get you connected. Because you need relationships, and people come in various ways to get connected to the church. But hear me, church. When Ken Johnson was here years ago, he was a chaplain of the Indianapolis Colts. He said this line, and I've never forgotten it, but I don't always live it. He said, Bob, everyone cheats. You have to decide what you're going to cheat. That's what Jesus is saying here. If you want to get off this treadmill, the answer is not getting more help so you can run faster. The answer is learning to say, time out. This is what needs to be done right now. And I've been serving Christ since I was 17, almost 18 years of age. And I've served in every position in the church possible. And one thing I've watched over time is Christians are an interesting group of people. When we get busy and the pressure's on, you know who gets dropped first? God. And the irony is that if God's not first, that treadmill is going to ruin your life. The only way to beat the treadmill, the only way we are going to manage what's coming in our lives, because folks, we're about to be blessed as a church. I don't know exactly when, but I know we're in a season that God is getting ready to really pour out His blessing upon us. I can feel it. I can almost touch it. But now I'm concerned that we don't get consumed by all this stuff, because we have to learn. We're trying to develop a culture here where you can tell Pastor Bob no. Pastor Bob, I'd love to do that, but I can't do that because I'm working 90 hours a week. See, once we develop a culture that says where they can even tell the pastor, because some people have a hard time telling the pastor no. I've had people say, I can't tell you no. And I tell them, I can't ask you to do anything. Because I don't want to make you busy. We're trying to create a culture here where people can soak in relationship. But to get in relationship, we need to have a certain amount of activity. So we have activity. And that's why we have many things going on. But I want you to hear me, church. We're not looking to get you here 7 days a week. I don't want you feeling guilty when you miss a church service. But what I don't want you to develop is the attitude and the habit of putting God last either. And there's a delicate balance. Because as we get on that treadmill, take it from somebody, you can take it for what it's worth. I'm an expert on this. It's amazing to me. Money gets short, God gets less. See, that's when I increase my giving. When time gets busy, drill into God, because He's the only one that has the capacity to help you to get off the treadmill. You know, Israel in the Old Testament was surrounded by cultures, and God gave them the Ten Commandments. And one of the things He said is take off 1 day a week and rest. And Israel's constant problem was of worshiping other gods. And when they began to worship other gods, they began to work 7 days a week. And God said to them, don't work 7 days a week, because remember, you were slaves in Egypt, and I don't want you to be a slave. And that treadmill will make you a slave. And so what are you saying, Pastor Bob? What are you saying? I'm saying this. If we're going to break through in 2018, a big part of it's right there with that treadmill. We've got to learn to prioritize in our lives what's really important. And I would really encourage you, not because I want your time or your money, but I'd really, really press you in this area, is to put God first. I'm amazed at what I've seen God. And every time I violate this, like Sabbath, I preach Sabbath to you folks, and I creep into my Sabbath working, and my wife's holding me accountable now to take off, because that when I don't take that Sabbath, I'm miserable to live with. And so are you. Make time to soak. Say, Pastor Bob, I got all these responsibilities. I helped somebody just last week. I said, this is what you have to do. I said, I see no margin in your world. This person was really in a jam. I said, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to leave this thing undone for 30 minutes. Oh, but I got to leave it undone. Ladies, leave the dishes in the sink. Guys, leave the garage dirty. Whatever it is, but you've got to start getting some me time. And Christians have a hard time with that. You need me time. You need God time, and you need me time. And my time's run out, so I'm going to wind it up. Father, I don't always communicate as clearly as I like, but I hear your heart on this. Help us, Lord, to manage the treadmill, lest we die. We cannot have it all. That's a lie. We have to choose our priorities. And I ask you to teach us to do that, because it's different for every person. Obviously, Lord, you're first always. But then these other priorities that come into our lives, how we choose to use our time and our money and our energy, we need your wisdom. And I pray for your wisdom, Lord, for your people, so that, Lord, we can soak in life and not just have stuff, but have significance, significant relationships. Soak in. Enjoy one another. Enjoy the Super Bowl. Enjoy it when our team wins. Commiserate with others when they lose. Father, help your people in Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen, amen. A couple things before we go. Sussex Pregnancy Care Center saves lives every year. And you're a part of that, because we take these bottles and they're out on the connection corner. And you just fill them with your loose change, and you bring them back in and take another one. And let's pray. I pray that what they do with that money is they save lives, and we can be a part of saving lives. So grab one of these, fill them up, bring them back. And I pray this year we do more than we've ever done. All of our spare change in our house, whenever we start, this is where it's going to go. We're going to put it in this jar, and I'd encourage you to do that, because they do a wonderful work of saving lives. Also, Starting Point, if you're new here, we'd love to get to know you, find out how you got here, answer any questions. You can go to the back of the sanctuary building here. You see Starting Point, a big sign there. There'll be some folks there to greet you, answer any questions that you have. You can also, if you're new here, text to the number on the screen, 302-725-0999. Next step, we have a way that we help people get connected here. We start with Starting Point, then it's next step. And in that gathering together, what we do is we share our vision, our values, things like this morning. We share these things, where we're going, and help people to get connected. If you've never been to that next step, we'd encourage you to join us. I'll be there in about 15, 20 minutes to teach that. It's a great time to answer questions and get to know people. And finally, if you don't know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, there'll be some folks here who would love to introduce you to Him. If you need prayer for anything, they'd also love to pray with you. So may God bless you. Next week, we're going to be gathering together in His name. Invite a friend. Be encouraged. Take some time to soak. Try to figure out how to slow down once in a while and get back on the treadmill and do life. May God bless you. We'll see you next week.